This fat guy was so clumsy that, when testing the heirloom sword, he stabbed himself with it. He was lucky to survive, and something inside him changed completely. He stopped eating constantly, and instead began to train. Fat Man started running all day, and practicing magical core exercises whenever. He took a break, then he trained day and night, swinging a wooden sword repeatedly, ignoring his fatigue. And even when the instructor told him to stop, he wouldn't listen. He kept repeating the same motions, even when it rained, until his hands were abraded and bleeding, and the wooden sword finally broke. In just 1 month, he had honed every move to perfection. Looking at his calloused hands, he was completely satisfied with the results. But the human body has its limits, and eventually he passed out from exhaustion. Still, he kept practicing, and after a while, he was no longer fat. Even his swordmaster was shocked by his swordsmanship and magic. So what caused this fat man to change so much? Well, the thing is, his body was now inhabited by the soul from the sword he had stabbed himself with. And it was by no means an ordinary sword. It's the story from the perspective of a hero, reincarnated as a sword. For centuries, it had been wielded by many legends. But the deepest bond this sword ever shared was with only one person, a hero named Leon Burke. Although he came from humble origins as a farmer, this man earned the title of Holy Swordsman through perseverance and wielded this magnificent blade. Although the sword passed through many hands, Leon Burke was the only one it considered a true soulmate. They journeyed from one continent to another, spending decades traveling together and purging the world. Finally, the day of the ultimate confrontation arrived. The white dragon of the Snow Range. It was a giant silver-scaled beast that drained every ounce of Leon Burke's strength before he finally defeated it. Alas, while they restored peace to the kingdom, a victory that gave Leon Burke the chance to rule the land, that triumph came at a cost. When the world once again saw sunlight and roses, the sword was finally laid to rest after centuries of slaying monsters. It was passed down through Leon Burke's bloodline, but no heir could fill the void in the sword's heart left by the beloved friend. With each prince that appeared in later generations, they grew increasingly inept and dull. This mediocrity reached its nadir when the sword was passed to a useless, obese young man. The moment the fat prince swung his legitimate weapon, the sword was horrified. This pig was an ill-mannered brat with not the slightest clue how to hold a sword. The sword quickly checked his stats, and a system window displayed everything it needed to know about the boy. His name was Adrian Leon Burke, a 16-year-old obese child whose actual power was reduced sevenfold, if I'm not mistaken. Simply put, his traits marked him as a completely useless idiot with almost no endurance. On top of that, he suffered from magic sensitivity disorder. Although the boy's surname clearly marked him as a descendant of Leon Burke, his pathetic stats suggested otherwise. The boy was so weak that even holding the sword upright was a struggle. He only had a big mouth, and his constant proclamations were driving the sword mad. After reading the holy hero's name, the boy summoned all his strength to lift the blade up, and began swinging the weapon wildly, terrifying everyone around. As this mobile slab of fat lunged blindly, the servants barely had time to scatter to avoid being caught in the crossfire. The stupidity peaked when the clumsy prince tripped over his own feet and accidentally drove the sharp blade straight into his belly. When he fell, there was no dramatic spin. He was genuinely impaled by his own sword. Everyone standing there was horrified by the tragedy and rushed to support the young prince. But do not forget the sword, which was enduring its worst moment. However, I suppose the boy's death wasn't entirely bad. Let me explain why. Adrian had inherited none of the qualities that would make him seem a true heir of Leon Burke. He stood out for all the wrong reasons. He was arrogant despite lacking talent, and his greed was boundless. In short, he was the very embodiment of the 7 deadly sins, whether lust, sloth, gluttony, or greed. If he became the next successor, there would be no kingdom left to rule. Yet that clumsy mistake that led to him being stabbed was about to change the kingdom's fate for the better. The sword ultimately possessed the prince's body the moment he became soulless. Within days, the castle staff began to notice a powerful, unprecedented change in the child's personality. He acted as if he had amnesia. The boy even refused to recall or acknowledge the tutor who had long endured his absurdity. Soon after, the king came to the room to see his son. At a glance, the arrogant sword could clearly tell this man was probably the brat's father. He was a bit surprised to see the king did not look as wretched as his son. Anyway, the father found his son's lack of manners quite upsetting. He didn't even bother to greet him. Adrian's teacher tried to cover for his pupil, saying the boy was experiencing some memory problems. The royal knights were shocked by this and suggested the court physicians examine the prince's mental state. A short while later, after the court physician had examined the boy, he concluded there was no physical brain injury. However, he believed trauma or psychological shock must have caused the memory loss. It seemed the king was not entirely convinced, and Adrian could sense His Majesty's suspicion from afar. The king told him that simply claiming to have forgotten all the wrongdoings Adrian had committed would not erase them. Even if Adrian had lost all past experiences. The mere thought that they were truly back at square one regarding Adrian's development was enough to provoke outrage. After telling his son how pathetic he was, His Majesty left the room. Meanwhile, Adrian, or rather, the sword inside Adrian's body, was not at all pleased with how it had been treated. This made it wonder just how awful the boy had to be to have earned such a reputation. Luckily for it, at least one person treated him like a human being. His beloved mother, who loved her useless son dearly. Good heavens, she even thought this sack of potatoes was quite handsome. The peasant mother was simply happy to have her son back. Only God knew how she would live without him. The sword could only feel pity for the mother, weeping over the son who lay in the grave. Night fell, and the happy mother finally decided to withdraw to her room. Seeing her so content forced the sword to reflect on the reality of its situation. It had indeed killed its friend's descendant, even though it should have protected them. But then the sword tried to convince itself it was not at fault, and regretting what had already happened would do no good. The least it could do now was seize this opportunity to fix things and erase the failures of the original Adrian. This body was fat and had no redeeming qualities. With that in mind, it found the first course of action to build strength. It planned to begin its quest for power by forging a magical heart within itself. Confidently, Adrian inhaled and began to concentrate magic, but it dissipated, as if nothing had happened. His body clearly refused to accept the flow of magic. He tried again, straining with all his might, but the result was still failure. Adrian came to realize that this body was damaged beyond belief. As he sank into despair, a ray of hope appeared in the form of a servant. The maid had brought a tonic personally sent by the queen. The tonic might not taste great, but it would prove very effective for his weak body. When the maid urged him to drink it, she began to fear the worst. You see, this wasn't the first time she'd brought this tonic. And given how violently Adrian had reacted before, she feared history would repeat itself. But fortunately for her, unlike the truly useless Adrian, who never understood the value of imported medicine, our Adrian could clearly sense that the liquid was rich in magic. Without waiting a moment, he snatched the cup from the tray and began to guzzle it down. Much to the maid's astonishment, after draining the bowl, he solemnly dismissed the maid. Once she had left, he tried to gather magic in his hands again. Fortunately, the tonic he'd taken was not bogus after all. Although the amount of magic he could gather was still insufficient, he decided to experiment further. He quickly followed the maid who had served the tonic and asked if she had any more of that good stuff. A few days passed, and the greedy smile on Adrian's chubby face was sufficient proof that he had finally succeeded in creating a mana heart. For him, forging a mana heart would have been child's play if not for this decrepit body. That was precisely why he had forgotten to account for one variable. The mana ignited in his heart began to cause excruciating pain. His entrails felt like they were being burned, and his chest could burst at any moment. Creating a mana heart is always a painful process, and if one couldn't endure it and fainted, it was game over. So the boy forced himself to concentrate as hard as he could, and synchronize with the stream of mana that was occupying his heart. At last he overcame the most grueling stage, and his efforts were not in vain. He felt proud not only for creating a mana heart, but because this time, the mana heart truly belonged to him. In his previous life, he only helped his master use a mana heart, but this time was different. He was deliriously ecstatic. When the mana heart was complete, he received a system notification identical to the one Adrian had once sent to his wielder. But this time he was the recipient. A system window popped up, followed by a cascade of other notifications, leaving our fatty utterly shocked. Simply put, this weakest body was still hindering the full exploitation of the mana heart's potential. Therefore, he was only permitted to use a few flashy skills out of many. Currently, he could access only two powers, Heavenly Eye and Heavenly Ear. Even then, their use was limited. As the name suggests, Heavenly Eye allowed him to see more clearly, to perceive with greater clarity, while Heavenly Ear enabled him to hear across a broader frequency range. He could even hear the maids whispering nasty things about him. But before he could eavesdrop on the servants any further, exhaustion struck as mana depletion robbed him of his vision. Of course, Adrian was none too happy about these limits holding back his potential. Back when he was just a sword, he could see and hear everything from afar. But now he could only squeeze out a meager amount of mana to use Heavenly Eye and Heavenly Ear for a short while. Still, he remained optimistic that once his overall mana increased, he would be able to do much more. Though his mana was low, his appetite was enormous. And now he was starving. So engrossed in pursuing power, the sword nearly forgot he was in a human body and needed to get used to it. A little while later, he reunited with his beloved mother of the household, and she looked happier than ever. The source of her joy was that her son had drunk every last drop of the tonic she had sent. Just as she was busy expressing maternal affection, a new figure appeared. When his mother asked if he recognized the man, Adrian casually denied it. Well, this extremely intimidating man was his mother's brother, Adrian's uncle. The mother hoped her brother would help his nephew recover his lost memories. However, the uncle viewed the boy's situation differently. The memories Adrian once had were worthless, so restoring that heap of rubbish would be a futile effort. This rude remark made our protagonist realize the man held a grudge against Adrian. To him, he only promised one thing, to help Adrian shed the excess fat, and add a bit of muscle, expecting him to do anything beyond that was unreasonable. Well, the mother was grateful even for that. Meanwhile, the way the man stared at the boy like a predator told Adrian he was done for. Adrian knew he was done for. Figuratively speaking, in the next scene, the poor kid was kicked to the ground. The bastard glared at the harmless child like a starving wolf. He made his point clear. Adrian wasn't even allowed to breathe without permission. Only when he approved would he teach Adrian the sacred, coveted sword techniques of the family. Of course, this infuriated our fatty to no end, against the one who had created the family's success. It was humiliating that these people were ungrateful to the very one who had invented their sword style. Adrian flew into a rage, stood up, and vowed that within 6 months, he would force his uncle to recognize him. If he failed, he was willing to become a puppet for his uncle to command. Conversely, if he won, he wanted his uncle to grant him one wish. Misreading the boy's confidence as arrogance, the most arrogant man in the world immediately accepted the terms. Adrian reflected on his situation. Despite boldly declaring victory, he knew this body would make things hell for him. Wrapping his body in mana, he began sprinting with the intent to burn off the excess fat. Suddenly, the uncle noticed the presence of mana in Adrian's body and was utterly shocked. He immediately halted him to ask a curious question. Had he already created a mana heart? The boy didn't miss the chance to boast because he desperately wanted his uncle to be amazed. It turned out the uncle was indeed disappointed, but not for the reason you'd think. He was angry, wondering who had urged him to create that mana heart. Because the harsh truth is that this technique is only for cheap, low-tier mercenaries. See, all that confidence he had was crushed by one revelation. What he'd learned wasn't worth a penny. A little while later, the confidence that had swelled like a fat belly deflated, and he was in utter confusion. As he pondered his uncle's words, the uncle had displayed his power by forming a mana circle and striking Adrian. That blow shattered the mana flow the boy had relied on. The technique the uncle used, called mana chaining, can crush the energy produced by a mana heart. Moreover, it's much easier to use and far more stable. Even the Eli Count's family, which stubbornly clung to the mana heart tradition, had completely faded a century ago. Now no one bothers with mana hearts anymore. With these new discoveries, Adrian was forced to return to basic theory on mana chaining. This is some knowledge about how mana use is classified. Mages typically rely on mana circles, while knights weave mana chains. A knight's rank is determined by how many chains they can weave. The first tier is 1 chain, then 2 chain, and so on up to the 5 chain tier. After absorbing the most important knowledge about this world, he realized his uncle wasn't bluffing. he also read a familiar keyword in the Altringen book. Recalling the past, Adrian remembered once being visited by a man named Anchingen. That man possessed strange skills, neither swordsmanship nor magic. This memory made the boy curl his lips into a smile, as if he already knew what to do next. A new day arrived with renewed confidence. Outside, as he warmed up to train, his uncle came and asked if he'd read the books he'd been given last night. If so, he'd surely realize how foolish creating a mana heart was. However, contrary to the elder's expectations, the boy's faith in the mana heart returned even doubled. The questioning man asked whether he was truly stupid or only pretending to be. Adrian decided to prove it with action. He began to emit mana and corrected his uncle, declaring that different types of mana hearts operate by different mechanisms. As expected, the uncle paid no heed to his words, thinking Adrian was acting like a stubborn mercenary, overly confident. Those mercenaries couldn't even pass the 2-chain tier before failing miserably. Nonetheless, he issued a challenge to Adrian. If he believed he was different, prove it by defeating a 2-chain knight. If he succeeded, the uncle promised to become his guardian, just as his mother wished. Adrian went further to provoke his uncle, wondering what use it would be to have him as guardian. That remark was a grave insult to a knight's honor. A Count of the Kingdom, commander of the Northern Army, leader of the Black Spear Cavalry, one of the 5 royal advisors, a 4-chain knight would not tolerate such presumptuous doubt of his abilities. The terrifying man began to unleash a horrific amount of mana, strong enough to shatter the ground beneath his feet just to make his point. He hoped that would be enough to prove his power, for he was the genuine article. And Adrian was tasting misery. But before the uncle pushed things to a life-threatening level for the prince, the nearby knights were forced to point their weapons at the count. The situation was very tense, and Adrian finally realized this would take far more effort than he had originally thought. A little later, collapsed on the floor like a sack of grain, exhausted from brutal cardio training, to rid himself of stubborn excess fat. The count's arrogant image kept hovering in his mind. If he couldn't defeat the 2-chain knight, that bastard with the smug scar on his face would humiliate and despise him for life. When he returned to his room, the physician was already waiting there to greet him unexpectedly. While the doctor tried to be tactful with polite greetings, the fatty wanted him to get straight to the point. It turned out this man had been ordered by the queen to treat the young prince to help him recover faster. But he avoided that treatment like the plague, and drove the man out of the room because he wasn't interested in healing magic. After all, healing magic works like revering time. It erases all micro-injuries and muscular wear. That means his body couldn't develop naturally and his efforts would be wasted. One day, while our boy was eating, his younger brother burst into the dining room. Of course, the sword didn't recognize this loudmouth, so a knight leaned in and explained it to him. Well, this guy was the 3rd prince, and I can assure you he's the typical toxic brother archetype from manga. Right now, he's here to mock Adrian for the recent accident when he actually stabbed himself with a sword and nearly died. Naturally, my boy had no interest in replying to those blatant taunts and wanted his half-brother to do something useful instead. The brother who liked to provoke others got provoked in return and decided to move on to the next rumor he'd heard. The street rumor was that Adrian had wagered with Count Balk Valhart, and because the bet involved him fighting a chain-axe knight, this malicious and insidious brother volunteered to be his opponent. Our boy had no idea who this foolish bastard was. All he could think was why all the descendants of this family were so troublesome. The one who had mocked him was the 3rd prince, Prince Jillian, famed for his talent and swordsmanship. This prodigy had formed 2 mana rings at the age of 4, so he was definitely a formidable force. A maid stepped forward and interrupted the quarrel, and handed Adrian a stack of letters. He couldn't understand why this pile of letters had been sent to him when no one had cared about him before. Suddenly, his attention hit the subject of the letters. Many letters requested a duel with the prince. Some offered to become his sparring partners. In short, all these people were basically conspiring to beat the prince for free. Our boy was truly furious at the audacity of these people. To help them vent their disappointment, he called the maid out and ordered her to record the names of everyone who had sent letters. In the next scene, while he was training, the northern commander suddenly tossed him a wooden sword. With a fierce conviction that he could teach the prince some swordsmanship. He didn't want to hear excuses about being unable to train the prince. Adrian bent to pick up the weapon, slightly annoyed that the man couldn't hand the sword over politely. But at that moment something happened. His whole body jerked, as his muscles suddenly contracted. This made Balk Valhard wonder whether the boy had been treated with healing magic. The boy mocked him for being called a knight while not knowing why. After all, once you receive healing magic, the muscles simply return to their original state and refuse to develop further. Balk Valhard agreed with that point, and went on to share that he also didn't intend to focus on healing magic. Now he would demonstrate a skill he wanted Adrian to watch closely. This technique was the kingdom's secret sword art, what knights used to build their core foundation. The weapon rose and swung violently, as the knight slashed in every direction. His flawless sword demonstration ended with a beautiful spin that left the prince speechless. When that impressive display finished, Adrian wondered whether this was truly the foundational technique for knights. Balk Valhard took that as an insult, and explained that the training weapon lacked sharpness, but it was better to stick to the basics when learning swordsmanship. Suddenly he began to laugh in his master's face. Adrian had recognized how sword mastery had evolved. The great dragon-slaying swordsmanship was now actually being used as a lowly training technique. The boy's face showed disappointment. Meanwhile, his master urged that this technique would not be enough to win the bet. So after learning the basics, he could always find another teacher. The prince rejected the idea of other sword styles, certain that this technique was more than sufficient. His words slightly irritated Balk Valhard, but in the end he indulged Adrian's wish. Back to the training session. Our boy was practicing sword swings, analyzing why dragon-slaying technique had come to be regarded as a lowly art. He understood that nature had to evolve this way, and that Balk Valhard's technique truly lacked the spirit of dragon-slaying. Even when performed correctly, those who rejected mana hearts had ultimately forgotten how to breathe soul into the blade, so they could not grasp the value of the dragon-slaying technique. While he was lost in thought, Balk Valhard clashed swords with Adrian, adjusted his stance, and advised him to focus force into the blade rather than the arm. He tapped his abdomen, and then the prince's leg, forcing him to correct his posture to distribute power evenly and properly into the weapon. Adrian knew his teacher was completely right. His current body was weakest when trying to mimic that technique. The same technique, but not the discarded rubbish. And he wanted to prove it to the whole world through his actions. Many days passed as his grueling training sessions continued. A month of intense training went by, and the system congratulated him for completing the task. Now his severe obesity had dropped to ordinary obesity, meaning his metabolism would adapt and his body would begin to change. The clumsy trait had disappeared, and training would only further hone him sharp. His mana was also increasing as the mana-sensing disorder trait faded. Adrian gained confidence with each sword swing, knowing he had improved greatly compared to a month ago. His mindset was to perfect his technique by 1% each day. Lost in thought again, Adrian's sword was knocked aside by his master. Those who had been telling him to stop stood silently under the heavy rain. As the prince's hands showed clear signs of fatigue, blood dripped from his bruised hands. While he looked at his uncle, wondering what had happened, Adrian looked back at the training scarecrow before him, and saw that he had actually chopped off both of its arms with a single sword stroke. He was speechless. As Balk Valhard roared, calling him an idiot who might have caused real harm and acted recklessly if a proper sword had been in his hands. Adrian's hands were covered in calluses and cuts. The system rewarded his intense focus with the super focus trait. This was a positive reward. And in his final thought, before fainting from exhaustion, our boy thought he might have been killed just now. Balk Valhard caught his student's gaze, looking at him while commenting on the prince's stubbornness. In the next scene, he woke up in bed and realized he had passed out midway through training. He had truly pushed his current body beyond its limits. Recalling the time when he was a sword, how perfect he had been in every way, his wielders had been anonymous war heroes, a holy sword, a mercenary king, and finally the founder of a kingdom. He had single-handedly led battles to victory, slew countless monsters, and paved the way for heroes to shine. Gruhan had always been a wise counselor and an excellent teacher. That's why he wanted to keep swinging the sword until he regained that perfect state, focusing all his effort on one goal. However, his current body was too weak and would be destroyed if he didn't rest properly. A month had passed since he created the mana heart, and he had accumulated a mana chunk during that time. Sitting in meditation, the prince prepared for the next tier. The tier the system was now ready to grant him access to. His body could now freely draw more mana during the expansion and evolution of the mana heart. The physique of his body also self-adjusted to accommodate the mana heart, granting physical benefits. The mana heart process of Adrian had been successfully activated. To test it immediately, he took up the sword and executed a swing that reached the level of a sword trainee. Now he could also access the most basic auric level, evidenced by surging streams of energy along the blade. The fundamentals had been successfully learned. In the following training session, Balk Valhard spoke of rumors spreading across the kingdom regarding the wagers. Because of that, he was forced to train the prince even more harshly. Although he was annoyed that Adrian still hadn't quickly found a sparring partner, the person who came to mind was none other than the kingdom's third prince. Besides that, he knew he couldn't face a dual-wielding warrior head-on, so he wondered if he could start by fighting someone who used a single blade. Adrian looked to Carls for an update on his arrangements. The knight replied, assuring the prince that he had followed instructions and sent sparring requests everywhere. However, Carls worried why the prince wanted training sessions with all these people. The reason was simple. All of these opponents held grudges against the troublesome, arrogant prince. That's why they were deliberately taking the opportunity to hurt him. But that was fine with our boy. He already knew their strategy. His only concern was to have his uncle act as referee for each sparring session. It was a simple task to ensure no one died in the match, something Balk Valhard surely would not refuse. A few days after that, the first sparring match was held. The first challenger looked up in amazement at the imposing palace of that rogue prince. The man was named Taylor Tailheim, and he was only the younger son of an ordinary baronial family. Years ago, that fat, rotten prince had accused him and publicly ridiculed his half-brother, instantly shattering his family's honor to the ground. Since then, Taylor Tailheim's family had lost respect and become a target of mockery. That was why he came to take revenge on the arrogant prince in this match. Shortly after, he met the prince and greeted him with utmost respect. Taylor emphasized his level as a novice knight of the single blade, although he gave an overly long introduction in an unofficial match. Our boy even insulted him, calling him weak. This confirmed to Taylor how arrogant this prince was. Balk Valhard recognized the youth's bitterness and hatred and ordered him to calm down since the match hadn't begun. He shifted from a killing machine to an instant fanatic after seeing the northern commander standing before him. Our boy even thought his uncle was more deserving of the prince's position, and Balk Valhard mocked him for his past as a worthless petty noble. Anyway, both combatants were instructed to take their positions as the match began. The two glared at each other. Taylor was the first to release his fighting spirit, appearing confident with a smile. As he lunged forward to punish the prince, he launched an overhand slash, but only glanced off. As Leon Burke criticized a few superfluous movements of the trainee knight, nonchalantly he stopped the attack, leaving the trainee knight dazed by the display of Tim Mana. Taylor jumped back to keep his distance, wondering how a Tim Mana could block a Zich Mana. His observation was actually correct, except that Taylor was only using a single chain, so the difference wasn't great and only made the prince feel a slight numbness. Interestingly, all the spectators began to hear a unique sound emanating from the sword, a sound that even his uncle was stunned by. This phenomenon is called the sword's ring. Taylor denied the prince's ability so much that he rashly charged again. This attack was heavier than the last, but our boy defended very well. The assault turned into a real fencing exchange between the two. Their blades traded blows. as each man retreated. At this point, Adrian was beginning to feel tired, highlighting how the mana loop completely opposed the Tim mana. Just that one clash made him feel his mana was about to collapse in reflux. At the same time, his opponent's expression was a sight to behold. Adrian recalled Taylor's position as the younger son in his family, and mocked him for being so stubborn in his emotions. As for our boy, he calmed himself and sank into even deeper focus. Adrian uttered an awakening spell. For whether the sword is called magical or divine, it is still a part of his soul. The mana heart officially accepted his grand will as the first color stained the once colorless mana heart. The slumbering will of the dragon slayer was officially summoned. It was the sword's memory fused with the heart, specifically designed to slaughter dragons. The heart skill of the dragon slayer swung into action. Adrian transformed into a draconic state. His body was now supported by the will of dragons as part of the dragon-slaying sword's power. From afar, the once helpless prince now looked like the embodiment of true death as a deep crimson aura radiated from him. Taylor was terrified just to see it. While Bulk Valherd called out to stop the match with determination, the ruthless prince lunged forward to slaughter his opponent. In a flashback, it was revealed that the prince had given a special request to them to stop him if he ever tried to kill his opponent. That is exactly what was happening right now, forcing the northern commander to intervene, activating a skill to crush the prince. The young man was flung into the wall, but at least Bulk Valherd stopped him in time. Suddenly, the remaining knights rushed in to restrain him from all sides, believing that the previous strike might have led to an assassination attempt on the prince. That is a grave crime. But our boy quickly stood up to stop them all from troubling his master. Indeed, he had ordered Bulk Valherd to act, but he didn't intend for him to actually knock him unconscious like that. The prince fainted, and as a result, the next time he woke, his mana heart was pounding from the aftereffects. His uncle truly was a monster with unsurpassed strength. At the moment he chose that attack, the reflux overwhelmed him. What was the good news? There were no aftereffects, so he was fine and he had won the match. The prince was smiling, when suddenly his master and uncle arrived to discuss something important. He recalled the image of the sword the boy had used, stressing that he had never taught him that style of swordsmanship. The prince revealed that he had merged with the sword's nature and become one with it. What troubled his uncle was that the same prince who had never seen real combat radiated a godlike killing intent. The very essence of his so-called spirit reeked of bloodlust. Even Bulk Valherd could not deny it. This shocked the prince, who had been bracing himself for a sentimental lecture. The northern commander snorted and shared that he was a soldier first, one who walks the path of victory at any cost. Despite his own ruthless philosophy, he still had an issue with Adrian's bloodlust, because a weapon cannot tell friend from foe. The prince argued that he was striving to correct his weakness, while his uncle showed concern for his development, wondering whether the boy might be consumed by the demon within. After 3 days of sparring, Taylor stood there defeated, while the prince thanked him for his help over the past days. Unfortunately, Taylor could not exact his revenge, and our boy even mocked him for failing to get what he wanted. Adrian told a servant to bring out a special gift, the gift he had intended to give the Taylor-Talheim family. He well knew the arrogant former prince had done terrible things to people in the past, and while this gift was not enough, it was something to atone to their family. Taylor was puzzled by the change in the rogue prince's demeanor, while our boy told him to leave, thinking he shouldn't bother tidying up the mess left by the original scoundrel prince. News of the rogue prince's sparring sessions quickly spread throughout the kingdom. People wanted warriors to face him and teach the petty prince a lesson. They all thought the crown prince would suffer. But even after many sessions, no one reported being harmed. Instead, the warriors returning from training had a good impression of our boy, describing the crown prince as kind and benevolent. Their opinion changed so completely that commoners thought these men had been brainwashed by the crown to keep silent. Ridiculously, when this news reached our boy, it made him furious. The only reason those warriors said nothing was because they had been beaten to a pulp in the matches. Adrian thought those nobles were pathetic and space-wasting, but his uncle mocked him for fitting that description as well. The crown prince, disgusted, looked at the most recent opponent. and politely threatened him to go and reveal the results of these sparring sessions. Our boy hoped this change would silence all the haters and circulating rumors. But the next day, even more rumors began to spread. This time, people thought the Fat Prince was fabricating match results to save face. The fellow really couldn't catch a break, refusing to care about the nobles, and he poured the last of his anger and frustration into training. Each swing of the prince's sword was fiercer than the last, slicing the wind with mana-wreathed flames. His mana heart blazed with vitality. As he turned to Carl's to ask about the remaining sparring opponents, the knight explained he'd face the final opponent today. The crown prince had reached a level where squire knights were no longer worthy opponents. But Carl's assured him the final foe was a full knight who had mastered his blade. This very knight had been dissatisfied with his family's techniques and became an elite, joining the order to further hone his swordsmanship. It was an alluring description to Adrian as he welcomed the arrival of Arwin. The woman stepped into the arena. While ordinary knights remembered her as a warrior of the Iron Lion Order, dubbed the bloom on a cliff, the thorned rose, and even a heartbreaker of men, she moved with elegant beauty. That the crown prince could draw her attention was praise of his standing. With Arwin determined and awaiting the bout. What about the audience? They certainly expected Arwin to punish the prince like walking a dog in a ritual of humiliation. The Iron Lion Order was regarded as a gathering of elite knights. Among them, Arwin was an extraordinary talent whose membership was confirmed. The question was why Adrian would accept such a skilled opponent. It turned out they had a past misunderstanding, leading our boy to assume that the worthless prince was causing trouble again. He asked a maid to recount the story so he could see how he had appeared. Embarrassed, she revealed that the arrogant fellow had indeed harassed Arwin. This basically meant the jerk was about to receive Arwin's payback for each prior offense. Adrian was disgusted by the reckless prince's misconduct. We actually saw the fat fellow place his hand on her, and she even mocked him for trying to treat a knight like private property. His wounded pride exploded and the prince lashed out, calling Arwin ugly. That was roughly the story, quite in line with the rogue's behavior when dealing with a knight. Of course, given how our boy was looking at Arwin now. The word ugly didn't even come to mind. She bowed to him in salute, believing he had not changed at all. The prince tried to save face, assuring her he had changed a great deal. But judging by her annoyed expression, it was clear he'd be thoroughly beaten in this match. The referee and his uncle, Count Bulk Valhard, was present. He allowed Arwin to formally introduce herself, and she offered her greetings. Bulk reminded Arwin to be careful because the young, powerful prince had quite a fierce blade. Jokes aside, the match between the two was about to begin as they took their positions. The official bout began exuding determination and coldness from Arwin's stance. Meanwhile, our guy was thrilled to experience the skill level of a true knight. The woman, full of killing intent, surged into action with graceful movements. The young prince parried the first blow, but the mana gap was so great it caused a direct backlash, forcing him to cough up blood. Beautifully controlled yet intensely focused, Arwin pressed the attack relentlessly to punish her opponent further. They traded sword swings, exchanged techniques, and clashed blades repeatedly. He was battered and nearly overwhelmed, leaving Arwin in full control of the match as she launched a decisive strike. The crown prince had to activate his dragon-slaying state and emit a killing aura. This savage killing aura stunned her, and Arwin's sword was successfully knocked aside by the young prince. She stepped back to her original position, gasping and studying the prince's swordsmanship. As for our guy, he could only barely hold on. Even using just one round of mana, Arwin was still in a different league from the others. At the same time, Adrian used his judgment skill to view the female knight's stats, revealing her strongest and weakest skills and even aspects of her personality. The fact the prince could see her level using only a limited skill proved that he could also defeat her. The market version Jing Games dieting to release a deep crimson radiance forced the female knight to do the same. The two combatants lunged at each other, closing in at dizzying speed, marking the start of a real battle. A few minutes later, both warriors were exhausted at the climax of the fight. It was a match of equal skill, So Bulk Valhard intervened and postponed today's bout until tomorrow. The prince acted arrogant, declaring that he would finish everything soon. And even Arwin mocked him with the same words. Both were proud and wanted to continue the duel. But Bulk Valhard wasn't going to sit here all day and believed both needed medical attention. A physician came to bandage the prince's wounds, but Adrian was too busy glaring at Arwin. She returned his glare with equal disdain. Both turned their faces away, sharing the same thought: they definitely would not lose to the other. The second day ended in the same stalemate, and on the third day both warriors refused to give up. Arwin was quite skilled, so the fact the prince lasted so long showed he was also very talented. Before the third round began, Adrian shared what he had meant to tell her for a long time. She wondered if he was going to apologize, and rejected the idea. After all, her knightly pride had been wounded and she wanted to reclaim it honorably. Although admirable, the prince had never intended to apologize in the first place. The wager was simple: the loser would grant the winner one wish, whatever it was and however long it took. The knights quickly objected to this decision, believing it was too dangerous for a royal prince to make such a declaration. Adrian told them to be silent and asked Arwin for her opinion. The female knight emphasized her position as one of the royal knights. That's why she normally couldn't accept such a condition. At the same time, now given a full opportunity to prove herself, she gladly accepted the wager. Adrian liked her choice and entered the third round. The two duelists swung their swords wildly, hopping to break the other's will first. It was here that Adrian launched a bold move and moved so fast it stunned the brilliant female knight. She couldn't believe he had become so much faster in a single day, as if he had always been hiding his true strength. The duelists clashed continuously, dancing across the arena. But this time the situation reversed. The prince dominated the battlefield, and to push her back, even scratched her face. Not stopping there, the prince closed in on her face with a decisive attack. Basically, his sword swing was faster than her ability to defend. The two weapons collided, a sword flew into the air and shattered. The female knight dropped to her knees, as the audience witnessed the victor of the match. Arwin could not accept this result, while the prince decisively declared victory over Arwin Kurgan. As for his prize, it was very simple. Prince Adrian Leon Burke wanted to possess her, but not in a perverted way, don't worry. Carls had secured the position of royal guard for the Grand Prince. The job was actually very easy. Despite the prince's pride, back then there were no riots at all. And seeing him now, Carls remembered the grueling training process that the prince undertook even in storms. His dedication led to the scarecrow being completely destroyed, and at that time he saw an intense fighting desire on the prince's face. It was then the royal guard knew Adrian was born to achieve greatness. Back to the current situation. The remaining guards were all horrified, including Carls. To own someone was a cruel thing, especially a knight. Arwin questioned whether that was truly what the prince wanted. Our fellow confirmed, adding that she was currently only an apprentice knight, incapable of defeating a rogue prince. So what he wanted from her right now was the full potential of the knight named Arwin Kurgan. Fortunately, this explanation lightened the atmosphere and surprised her. While Adrian declared his intent to keep a loyal knight, one who would not only protect him out of royal duty, but a knight loyal to him through every hardship and trial. Thanks to his scanning ability, he could foresee Arwin's outstanding swordsmanship. That was why deciding to claim Arwin as his knight was the right choice. Now let's explore her past story. When the younger version of Arwin longed to become a knight, she was among the best of her age, and despite her talent, no one acknowledged her as worthy. So she worked harder, twice as much as others, to defeat every opponent in every battle. After defeating every apprentice she knew, she achieved astonishing results. Even after all she had done, they still could not recognize her as a true knight. However, at this moment, she was being properly esteemed. She was acknowledged, her potential seen, and a future promised by the Grand Prince himself. She could hardly believe his words. So she begged Adrian to promise one thing, which was to treat her as a knight first and a woman second. If Adrian could do that, she would obey all his orders. It was an admirable request. They locked eyes as Adrian accepted the proposal. Immediately, that brilliant female knight knelt before the prince who had recognized her, vowing to dedicate her life to Adrian Leonberg. The audience watching were stunned by this, and to honor her properly, the Grand Prince officially hailed her as a knight. He recited the oath that reminded me of the scene in the Game of Thrones when James knighted Brian St. In the next scene, we see Arwin training tirelessly. Her colleagues couldn't believe she had sworn loyalty to such a rogue prince. Many of them spread malicious rumors, wondering if she had some shady relationship with the prince in secret, as if he were using her as a lover under the guise of a knight. All these stupid rumors began to annoy our young man. He still couldn't shake the bad reputation like Lloyd Fronteras. People treated him like society's scum. And witnessing the prince's helplessness, the royal guard called him over because of what Adrian had said that day. On the final day of the match, Adrian had declared that he did not desire a knight to guard him merely out of royal duty. His words clearly impacted Carl's deeply, yet even so, our fellow affirmed he stood by what he'd said. After all, if the crown assigned Carls to another post, he would have to comply instead of remaining loyal to the prince. To reassure him, Adrian promised Carls that he could make a similar vow like Arwin's if he wished. With sincerity in his eyes, the royal guard asked the prince whether he would accept such a vow from him. Surprisingly, our young man refused, believing he had no interest in Carls or in the joy of nurturing him. It was a simple remark, but our fellow was truly serious about what he said. In any case, Adrian received an official notice from the crown, releasing him from his period of confinement and allowing him to attend the upcoming banquet. The surprise, the house arrest was lifted nearly 2 months earlier than expected. So despite the king's initial fury, something had caused him to change his decision. The prince had no idea what was running through that man's mind, and frankly, he didn't care about being freed from confinement. After all, he didn't plan to leave the palace, so it didn't really affect him much. A curious maid read something that caught Adrian's attention. It was a new invitation addressed to the Grand Prince. She handed the paper to him, urging him to open it and read its contents. The event was a social gathering for young nobles, a club the disreputable prince used to frequent. The maid described it as a seedy place full of debauchery, implying young drink and prostitutes. Our young man didn't want to follow that path, so Adrian flatly refused the pointless venue. But then he read the back of the paper. The letter was from Bernardo of the Eli family, who was said to be his friend, a name that truly stirred memories in him. From his uncle, Adrian recalled that the Eli family strongly supported the use of mana hearts and ultimately fell into ruin a century ago. Curious about his friend's family, the prince decided to attend the event, secretly hoping that his friend's family had not completely collapsed. 4 months after possessing Adrian Leon Burke's body, the young prince had lost a lot of fat. He had commissioned a tailor to make an outfit that suited his style, keeping it very minimal. The amazing thing, our young man had finally shed the excess flab, and now looked like a model instead of a balloon. Even the prince was shocked by his own transformation, and the tailor was ecstatic. He let him handle the second outfit for court as well. However, he asked him to wait a bit because his measurements might change again. In the next scene, the prince was on his way to attend the social gathering. Adrian knew he was in a bad position, constantly followed by guards and the coachman. It was a suffocating experience. Suddenly, he noticed a scar on the maid's neck. It turned out to be due to her incompetence. Had she done something wrong? And that fat bastard prince had punished her for it. Adrian truly despised the old prince for terrorizing people. Although he had met her several times, he had never asked the maid's name. So he asked directly and learned her name was actually Adelia Byron. The Byron family name flashed in Adrian's mind, because it was hardly listed among the nobility. In the past, when cities did not yet exist, many races flourished alongside humans. Humans were pillaged and slaughtered for their weakness. But then came an era when humans became saviors of their own fate at the end of the Great War, rising to be the continent's strongest species. The most outstanding among them were called the 5 vassals, and among those 5 heroes, one wielded the sword Gruhorn, a woman who glared fiercely at the giant monsters, wondering what she and her loyal sword would do after the war ended. She leapt into battle and beheaded the king of the giants with a single strike, killing him and marking the end of the era of exploitation, earning her the title Bloodsteel Sword Vassal Agnes Bayern. She was unique, both cursing the monsters and cutting them to pieces. Every sentence was a string of curses, forming combos of oaths, and she struck armor faster than Eminem. Even Gruhorn at the time was uncomfortable with that woman's swearing. This friend was obsessed only with memories of her, but he was stunned to see her descendant sitting right before him. That made him wonder what had happened to the Bayern family to fall to such a low status. Anyway, with announcements that they had arrived, our young man stepped out of the carriage and planned to speak properly with Adelia afterward, making the maid and the royal guards embarrassed. Outside, a silver-haired man greeted his dear old friend. This was Bernardo of the Eli family, who expressed deep gratitude to the prince for his change. Strangely, Adrian noticed something interesting that made Bernardo curious. Our young man assured him that it was a good idea he came because tonight would be very entertaining. In the next scene, they were in the club where debauched lackeys were mumbling and teasing each other with delight. The party was packed, but Bernardo was shocked by the prince's behavior. The bastard who usually got wasted and started flirting was silent this time. The aura around Adrian was also completely different from before. In fact, when a drunk came up to mention the rumor of his victory over Arwin, he didn't even utter a word. The whole party began to buzz about his spectacular win, and these disgusting men curious about how Arwin might look beneath her armor. He calmly replied by asking the man if he had any siblings with him. The man revealed he had a younger brother, which put the prince much more at ease. Why? Because he wanted to finish that bastard off and land a punch so powerful it would send him flying. The scene grew tense, sobering everyone there in fear and shock. Even Bernardo. Adrian was thrilled that the man had a brother, because he could now happily crush his balls without wiping out the family line. The man screamed like a woman while the cold, majestic prince of ours declared that his brother would be the family's new heir. The beating continued as Adrian's bloodbath terrified the crowd. The man was beaten senseless, not even understanding why he had become a punching bag, taking the opportunity to teach everyone a lesson. The prince emphasized that he would not tolerate being treated like scum, even if he was regarded as such. His eloquent, cutting words left the entire party utterly unsettled. To make his point clear, Adrian threw another punch because a fist speaks far more effectively than words. After pulverizing the first man with what felt like a billion Mike Tyson-style blows, he summoned Bernardo, who immediately dropped to his knees. This friend did not want the same fate as that man at all. The prince even chillingly reiterated his earlier claim that he would make today rather interesting. Bernardo had no idea what the hell had happened to this person, and received orders to summon the royal knight. He sped off like a rocket to carry out the command. Meanwhile, the rest of the party could only silently stare at the prince. Adrian told the women at the back to leave, drawing the attention of one particular man. The man tried to slip out, but his presence was noticed. He was allowed to leave with the woman, so long as Adrian could rip off his balls like he had earlier. Just the thought froze all the men with fear. Honestly, there is no worse threat than having one's jewels trampled until they burst. Adrian told them they had been rude to him by refusing to kneel, even mocking him and insulting his knight, to bring proper charges and punish these men for the consequences of insulting the crown. He had brought royal guards, specifically Carl's, who charged them with treason. With a single order, the royal guard happily dragged them all out. Adrian eagerly gave the order, ensuring no one would escape punishment. After this clash, the prince was summoned before the king for yet another reckless disturbance. 14 noble scions were arrested for every conceivable reason. The king was furious that his son had abused royal power and punished the victims' families. But with 14 houses involved, the king would face fierce backlash. Adrian knew his father well and struck at the heart of his fear by emphasizing that all these people were, after all, expendable and hopeless trash. In fact, he advised his father to send letters to certain individuals, specifically the siblings of the bastards who had been arrested. Hearing the young man's words, the king ordered him to withdraw, and the prince complied without worry. Now back to his affair with the maid. Despite his attempts to console her, poor Adelia still sobbed, wondering what she had done wrong. She was like a puppy further ruined by the old prince's abuse. Her family wasn't even on the official roll of nobility. Even the descendants of the Leon Burke house seemed unaware of the Bayern family's significance, as if a part of history had been erased. Adelia Byron's unparalleled contributions were no longer remembered. Everything about the Byron line had ended, yet our young man could clearly see the latent sword potential in Adelia. This woman was a mysterious S-rank with wild traits coursing through her. First, Butcher is an activated trait when she sees blood. Berserker is another trait showing the woman is obsessed with battle. At the same time, the maid also has fragile heart and caregiver traits, making her wonderfully passive. So this maid possessed unparalleled swordsmanship and combat ability, but no trait could control her once she went mad, to the point that our young man even considered unleashing her massacre upon the world. After all, it would be a waste not to try, since she was an S-rank talent. Let's talk about the servile disposition. It basically means a servant feels loyal and happy serving their master. Exploiting that as leverage, Adrian demanded she swear absolute loyalty to him. It was a puzzling request since she was already his maid, but Adrian made it clear he wanted more. He wanted her to become his knight and to do it immediately. The shy, fragile girl burst into tears, refusing such a grand role because she believed herself unworthy. But our young man knew the truth about her family and pledged that he would take responsibility for her. In return, she had to swear fealty to him and serve without question. The strategy was that if Adelia couldn't control her madness herself, he would control it for her. At first, she wondered whether he would truly follow through on the promise to take responsibility for her family. The prince's confirmation made her truly happy. Our young man even offered to summon them to the capital so she could see them anytime. This made her overjoyed. Enough for her to vow loyalty. So, like Arwin, she recited the oath and pledged to serve the crown prince for the rest of her life. Adrian was pleased with the arrangement and officially granted her the status of maid who would obey his orders unconditionally. He even gently patted her hand, bringing a smile to her face. But even the prince was anxious, wondering if he was making the right decision here. Adrian thought about all the rumors spreading through the palace since he took over this body. People whispered about his every gesture, about how silent and unstable he seemed. They gossiped about the former rotten prince summoning the children of high nobles, beating them and throwing them into dungeons for his amusement. Then there was the latest scandal, the one everyone enjoyed most, that he had appointed a lowly maid as his personal knight, someone who had never held a sword. Adrian knew that no matter what he did, people would hate him for the reputation left by the body's previous owner. Even the maid he chose as a knight was twisted into another ugly rumor. People assumed he was building a harem under his control above all else. He hated how people felt entitled to judge his life and choices. He never imagined that turning a maid into a knight would create such a storm. It felt like everyone was waiting for him to fail. He pictured his father, the king, angry, saying he would once again have to clean up his son's mess. He could already hear his uncle cursing his name as always, and he imagined his younger brother mocking him with a superior, clever air. Adrian sank deeper into these thoughts, weighed down by disappointment and fear. Then another maid rushed in to announce the queen had arrived. Adrian panicked immediately, his heart clenched as he silently prayed to the gods for mercy and a brief reprieve. Adrian was exhausted from the arguments and constant attention. His mother added fuel to the fire. She scolded him, saying she had truly believed he had reformed, but now it seemed he was reverting to old vices. She declared it was time for him to enter society properly and get married. She said that once he chose a match, he would finally settle down and stop behaving like a madman. Adrian didn't even understand what she meant, but the queen didn't care. She raised her voice like any angry mother and ordered him to obey because mothers are always right. Since she had decided it was time for him to marry, he would marry. With that, she turned and left, leaving him stunned, standing there wondering what to do next. Then Adrian summoned the maid Adelia, who sat before the prince clearly anxious and frightened. He explained a few things to her and she timidly asked if she would truly receive mana. Adrian calmly confirmed that she would receive a special kind of mana, a mana heart. Then he used his own mana and formed a heart inside her body. thinking about how this world had forgotten the legendary Sword Queen. At least he had not forgotten her. He remembered every detail, the path she took, the way the sword moved as if it had life in her hands, and how she wielded it with absolute grace. He wanted to awaken a similar destiny within Adelia because he believed this path belonged to her. He even remembered the powerful rhythm of the Sword Queen's mana heart when it once beat with pride and resolve. The mana heart finally took shape inside Adelia, and a system notification confirmed that the imprinting process was complete and stable. Adelia stared stunned at the soft golden light emanating from her chest. She whispered skeptically, asking if that really was the power of mana. When the process ended, Adrian explained that what she had witnessed was the refinement method to form a mana heart. He told her to practice it on her own whenever possible. Suddenly, Adelia became anxious, but her worry shifted as Adrian collapsed to the ground, his knees scraping. The strain of creating the mana heart had drained him. She rushed to him, but he refused help, brushing her off and saying he was just a little tired. Adelia hesitated, then softly asked, "How could someone like you choose a lowly maid like me?" Adrian had no patience left for questions and told her to leave. When she did not move, he turned and asked why she was looking at him like a lost puppy. Adelia quickly bowed her head, a mix of fear and respect, swearing she would serve him with absolute loyalty for the rest of her life. The answer pleased him. He reminded her never to forget that he was her master, and Adelia took those words as a badge of honor. However, as Adrian turned away, Adelia quietly thought she might not remember that promise in the way he expected. Carls came to report to the prince about Bernardo Eli. He explained he had just heard that Bernardo was taken by the royal guards as a witness in a recent matter, and by official order, strict measures were in place so no one could see him before the trial. Adrian found it puzzling that trials even existed in this world. He casually asked if he needed to attend one. His aide calmly replied that the royal family never had to testify. A sense of relief washed over Adrian like a weight lifted, but it also unsettled him. He realized they were suddenly making a big deal out of the whole trial. In the conversation, Adrian's attention drifted to Adelia. He looked directly at her and asked how she had been lately. The poor girl froze in surprise, clearly not expecting his concern. Then Adrian asked her about the mana and whether it had stabilized. Adelia composed herself and replied that it had settled. Hearing that, Adrian rose without hesitation and declared that from now on she would join him in training. He told her to change clothes and meet him at the training grounds, and to throw away the rag, because from this moment on she was a knight. At the training grounds, Adrian began to stretch, slow and relaxed. Before he could start his routine, someone interrupted. It was his uncle, Balk Valhard. He asked a question and Adrian replied with a sharp tone, clearly not interested in dealing with him today. It was his uncle, Balk Valhard. He asked a question and Adrian replied with a sharp tone, clearly not interested in dealing with him today. Adrian asked his uncle if he had heard the rumors and openly declared that he was turning her into a knight. Those words immediately angered Balk Valhard, as always. He shouted accusations that Adrian had recklessly forced a young woman to become a knight and wasted time on foolish ideas. Adrian snapped back, telling him not to meddle in his affairs as he always did. Their argument grew louder. Sharp words flew back and forth until Adelia finally completed her 10th lap and collapsed to the ground. Balk Valhard didn't bother to glance at her. Adelia panted and trembled, beginning to apologize, begging forgiveness for performing so poorly. Adrian immediately told her to forget it. He stepped forward and placed a wooden sword in her hand, explaining that today he would teach her the basic stances. He demonstrated a few simple, solid movements, and precisely then asked Adelia to try it herself. What happened next left everyone frozen. Like a skilled ballet dancer, Adelia began to move. Her steps were fluid, her posture perfect, and her sword followed each motion with surprising grace. Both Balk Valhard and Adrian stood staring in disbelief as she flawlessly reproduced his techniques after watching only once. When she finished, she looked at him and softly asked if she had done it right. Adrian felt a chill run down his spine. For the first time, fear overwhelmed him. At this rate, she might surpass him too soon. He thought that control only works when the weak fear the strong, and if she developed far beyond him, she could become dangerous. But his train of thought was cut off when he noticed Bulk Valhard looking at Adelia with a lascivious gaze. Adrian stepped closer and nudged his uncle, warning him to behave and not entertain any filthy ideas about her. Bulk Valhard only sneered and mocked him, saying that Adrian was still a novice, having taken up the sword only a few months ago, and someone like him couldn't handle such immense potential. That was Adrian's limit of tolerance. He would not accept being lectured by someone else. His mana heart surged, along with a heart that contained the depths of the giant kings, Radiant Dragon, and entities that had drained the blood of countless lives. A portion of a soul answered the fury and rose at his command. Red flames surrounded his body as his momentum exploded outward. He glared at Bulk Valhard with a cold authority, his voice low and decisive as he declared that Adelia belonged to him. Adrian warned his uncle not to look at or even think about Adelia, for he truly hated others attempting to claim what did not belong to them. In that moment, he suddenly realized his sense of reality was slipping away. His perception sank into a strange state, filled with cold and darkness where he could not feel life or death. He immediately understood the danger. If this continued, his body would merge with the sword, and his soul would be devoured by the cursed sword Gruhorn. Adrian knew he could not let that happen. He resisted the pull, faced the demon core, and forced the demonic power back into its cage. Slowly, he returned to being the prince, just in time to hear the end of his uncle's speech. As the uncle rambled about how a common knight could save 10,000 soldiers, and how an exceptional knight could protect hundreds more, Adrian didn't bother to listen. To him, this uncle was no longer just family, but a grand border commander, leading armies amid corpses and war. Still, Adrian had no interest in this moralizing lecture. His indifference angered his uncle, who began to lash out at the boy. That was when Adelia finally spoke up. She declared that her body and soul belonged to Adrian, and she would not heed her uncle. Adrian felt a flash of pride at her resolve and smirked at his uncle. He calmly said the original goal of the training was simply to help her lose weight. Now that she had come this far, he had nothing left to teach. He told his uncle to leave and stop interfering in his affairs. His uncle huffed away, face stern and clearly furious. Even after that day, he kept coming to the palace relentlessly, watching Adelia and their training from afar. Because Adrian had forbidden him to meddle or intervene, the uncle could do nothing but watch. Seeing that proud man suffer in silence became a strange pleasure to Adrian. Before long, Adelia assumed her stance with the sword once more, and Adrian could hardly believe his eyes. She had learned the sword's rebirth technique. He applauded, genuinely pleased with her progress. And for the first time, Adelia herself looked proud, though the peaceful moment did not last long. His uncle cut in again, probing whether Adrian had taught her about the mana hearts. When Adrian confirmed it, his uncle's anger erupted and he began to shout. He accused Adrian of teaching her ridiculous street tricks instead of keeping them to himself. Adrian spun around and ordered him to leave immediately. The uncle cursed him, claiming there was a far better path and that Adelia possessed unimaginable potential, something Adrian had now ruined. Adelia remained composed and had his guard escort the uncle out. The uncle refused to be touched by a mere soldier and stormed off on his own. After the tense atmosphere subsided, Adelia quietly asked whether the techniques she was learning were truly just petty tricks. Adrian firmly denied it. He told her the uncle didn't understand what he was talking about. He explained that the truth was people of this era had completely forgotten what a mana heart truly was. Otherwise, they would never discard it like a pair of tattered shoes. With quiet certainty, Adrian vowed she would soon discover Mana's true power. Then, at the training ground, the uncle returned and threw a wooden sword at Adrian's feet. Demanding he prove himself, the uncle declared he would use only a single mana round, and if Adrian could force him to retreat even half a step, he would acknowledge Adrian's knowledge and power. Adrian picked up the sword and calmly asked what the wager was. The uncle replied that if Adrian won, he would grant him one wish, anything he wanted, even the family's secret techniques. It wasn't something Adrian truly desired, but he accepted the terms without hesitation. Adrian immediately lunged, aiming straight for his uncle's throat. The uncle merely smirked and said, "Clearly Adrian will aim for the throat." As expected, Adrian attacked his uncle's throat again and again. Each strike was fast and sharp, but the uncle evaded them all with ease. He moved lightly, dodging the attacks until he trapped Adrian's sword and gently pushed him back, asking if that was all he had. Then he shoved Adrian aside and sneered, asking if he had given up. Adrian gritted his teeth. He was stubborn and found his uncle unbearably annoying, but he could not deny one thing. His uncle was frighteningly strong and clever. He was waiting for the moment Adrian drew mana, because only then could he land a far more decisive blow. But Adrian would not give him that satisfaction. With that thought, he began talking to himself, finding it strange that 400 years ago countless people possessed mana hearts, and the knights who held them achieved incredible feats. Yet when a somewhat useful skill appeared later, people simply forgot the mana heart and embraced that new skill. Over time, people began to believe that mana chain techniques were a far superior way to manage mana than the mana heart. Bulk Valhard heard him mutter and asked what exactly he was trying to say. Adrian calmly replied that he completely disagreed with that belief, and that the comparison itself was mistaken. Adrian said it was never because the mana heart was weak, but because its wielder was weak. He stated plainly that not all mana hearts were fragile or inferior. Then he asked Bulk Valhard if he had ever heard of the heroic battle song. Bulk Valhard shouted for him to shut up, saying the training ground was for exchanging moves and blade work, not for singing and poetry. Adrian merely smirked and called him a fool for labeling the mana heart a low-tier technique. Having said that, Adrian began to recite the poem engraved in his chest. He sang of 100 victories before 20 disciples, all who dreamed of becoming heroic warriors. As the exalted words flowed, the heroic battle song gradually took shape, and power began to rise in him with each line of verse. The strength of those victories poured into his body, into his arms, and finally into his blade. Slowly his sword began to glow, answering the poem with its own brilliant light. A system notification appeared that the practice song effect had been activated, and mana flowed around Adrian. But Bulk Valhard remained unimpressed, saying that whatever Adrian did was futile. As long as Adrian relied on the mana heart, it could not surpass the mana chain. Adrian lunged at his uncle, and Bulk Valhard easily evaded with his sword. Mana from the mana ring repelled the flow of the mana heart, knocking Adrian lightly backward. But in truth, to master the poem, Adrian had practiced it over 100 times and endured the ring's mana more than 1,000 times. In those 100 matches, he had experienced thousands of waves of opposing mana. He slashed down, unleashing the power of Stens. His blade now felt perfected, but when he attacked again, Bulk Valhard still dodged. Adrian pressed, striking in rapid succession, and for the first time, Bulk Valhard began to show worry. Bulk Valhard gathered all his strength to shove Adrian away. He told Adrian he was arrogant to claim that not all mana hearts were equal. He drove his sword into the ground, creating a shattering blast. Adrian slammed into the wall. Bulk Valhard declared he was bored with the match and insisted it was over because he had won. However, Adrian realized that at a normal level, the heroic battle song alone wasn't effective enough. He braced his sword, rose, and began recounting history from 400 years ago. He explained how the knights had made a fatal mistake. They left no enemies for future generations. They believed their sword techniques, the 6 beats of the heart, and poems of their victories would be passed down intact. But this new world had forgotten the songs of dragons and giant kings, reducing them to absurd, unbelievable legends. Bulk Valhard did not listen at all. He believed Adrian was daydreaming and couldn't understand a word he said. Adrian grew tired of the mockery and regarded his uncle as an arrogant, foolish knight. Suddenly, the darkness of the demon sword Gruhorn rose like a storm in Adrian's eyes. He declared that if Bulk Valhard didn't understand what true power was, he would teach him. Demonic hands completely engulfed Adrian's body and mind. He began to chant the dragon-slaying poem, his body straining under immense power. Some verses were omitted due to his low rank, but a powerful stanza remained. Adrian repeated the incantation over and over. The pure energy of that stanza surged at Bulk Valhard. Adrian attacked. and Bulk Valhard realized that if this continued, he might die. Another explosion erupted, sending Adrian flying backward to the ground. When the dust settled, Bulk Valhard revealed that he had not used a single small ring as promised, but a complete set of 5 rings. However, Adrian was ecstatic, even with all 4 rings activated. His sword remained unharmed, cutting through the ring's mana with the power of the mana heart. He stood up, leaving Bulk Valhard astonished and confused. Bulk Valhard had expected the ring's mana to surpass the mana heart, but it did not. Adrian looked his uncle squarely in the eye and stated calmly, but firmly, that he had been defeated. Afterward, the dragon's song and the sword tormented Adrian's frail body. He curled up on the bed, gritting his teeth, cursing the Justisang room. Damn that place. Later, Adrian learned that that pain was the price of forcing out the power of the Justisang well. The dragon's poem was beheaded. His body was now battered, but he knew it was worth the risk. This was the first martial achievement he had woven with his own hands, and he felt proud of it. He recited the poem over and over from the depths of his heart. The system displayed that his duel grade had slightly increased, and he thought that would be enough for the match with the third prince. Suddenly, Adelia cut in, radiant with joy, because he had finally awakened. She said that after he fainted, the queen had been furious with Bulk Valhard, and it was the first time she had seen the queen so angry. Inwardly, Adrian felt a bit pleased, thinking his uncle deserved the queen's scolding. Adelia also told him that Bulk Valhard had requested to be informed the moment Adrian woke up. Adrian did not like that idea, but he lay down and told her he had only just regained enough consciousness to know what had happened and wanted to rest. He knew that if his soul damaged by abusing the Justisang well didn't properly recover, he would pay a terrible price. Memories of past realities would blend and become chaotic, and eventually the boundaries of reality would collapse in his mind. He would become a useless madman, trapped in the sword's memories. Just thinking about that pit made him recoil, for it was the worst fate he could imagine. Then he told Adelia about her ancestor Byron, a legendary swordsman, and how she might inherit the power of the Justisang room. Adelia imagined how extraordinary her ancestor must have been. Adrian explained that to fully benefit from the poem, she would need to become far stronger than she was now. He asked her what she really wanted to learn. Adelia was stunned by the question. Her eyes widened, she stammered and hesitated, and finally voiced her true feelings. She declared that she wanted to become Adrian's sword. Hearing that, Adrian was struck dumb, completely stunned by her words. Clearly, some Justisang rooms begin with a compelling trumpet call, while others begin with the first step across the plain, and some begin with a solemn vow. Like the vow Adelia was making now before Adrian, that she would sacrifice her life for him and devote everything she had to his 5 needs for his sake. The system indicated she was offering a point of submission. Sensing the power and its presence, he realized this was Adelia's Justisang well room. Some Justisang rooms also affect others, and in this case a new Justisang room formed, creating a point of dominion. A point of submission is the bond between master and servant, and it was astonishing. The descendant of the Sword Queen had formed this submission right before his eyes, granting him a boon he had never expected. He smiled, thinking of all the powers he would gain, as long as Adelia's submission was directed at him. Her growth would also benefit his own endeavors. He thanked her for her kindness, and Adelia looked at him with admiration. Adrian still didn't know what help or advantage she would bring, but he felt confident about the future. A few days later, Adrian was in the kingdom. Bored to death, his mother came over and asked if he was feeling any better. Adrian disliked being questioned and had difficulty facing those who had loved the body's former owner. He was equally awkward with his mother, who looked a little frail. She asked if he hated his uncle and then tried to excuse him, saying he didn't really mean any harm, so even if Adrian felt uncomfortable, he should let it go. When Adrian replied that he didn't feel that way, she shouted that he certainly should. Adrian was confused, wondering what she really wanted from him. Since he had swept away that pride and arrogance, it was hard for him to tolerate. That day he had sown a mental demon in his uncle's mind. If Bulk Valhard couldn't overcome it, the demon would grow and he would lose his proud martial prowess. Adrian didn't care about the consequences for his uncle. that would be his uncle's loss alone. His mother said his uncle had spent his life closer to the sword than anyone, which made his soul awkward and coarse. But recently Balk Valhard seemed fond of Adrian and had even personally persuaded the king to lift Adrian's house arrest early. As soon as the restriction was lifted, Adrian threw a tantrum that put his uncle in an awkward position. Only then did Adrian realize his uncle had legitimate reasons to be angry, but he still behaved like a spoiled, ungrateful child, acting as if the man had done him any favors. While recovering, an elderly scholar named Niccolo Marchiadel was invited to tutor him. Naturally, Adrian Leon refused to cooperate. The old scholar Carls and Adelia watched the prince flopping on the floor in a tantrum. Niccolo tried to offer some encouraging words, but the spoiled prince misunderstood him. After calming down a bit, Adrian insisted he didn't need any lessons because he already knew everything he needed to know. Because he was so adamant, Niccolo proposed an alternative plan. They could simply sit and discuss various topics. If he could prove he didn't need help, the scholar promised never to visit again. By the end of the day, the prince was fired up, openly joining academic debates about human nature. Niccolo even suggested a book for him to study based on the topic they'd explored. In this text, the relationship between monarch and subjects is presented as a kind of contract. Rulers provide part of the military and economic power to those in authority, and those authorities keep the ruler on the throne through loyalty. Throughout the years living as Gruhorn, Adrian had believed relationships had to be reciprocal. Before he realized it, the whole day had passed. The old scholar cleared his desk and ended the session. When Niccolo said goodbye, the prince grinned from ear to ear. He had never been so happy just chatting. The moment he heard the door close, he realized what had happened. He had been tricked into taking part in a full lecture against his will. That old man was quite formidable, but Niccolo was also surprised by the crown prince. The boy was very different from the rumors, banned from training, and exempt from Niccolo's lessons. The prince's schedule was empty all day long, and he grew bored before he could even complain about life's choices and flopped back onto the bed. A particular visitor, his uncle Balk Valhard, prompted him to get up. Adelia invited his uncle in. It had been several days since the last sparring match. Balk Valhard looked pale. He still couldn't overcome the mental demon his mischievous nephew had planted. Today the uncle had come only to apologize. He had broken his promise to himself and caused the prince to be severely injured because of it. He would offer no excuses, even if Adrian's injuries were the result of overexertion. His uncle must have been greatly tormented by the trouble of wounding a member of the royal family. To atone for his mistake, Balk Valhard offered to grant the boy anything he wanted. If he had to sacrifice his eyes or an arm to make amends, he said he would. In the end, Adrian pitied the talented man bound by such a petty mental demon and decided to be generous. The crown prince made his request. He only wanted to get out a little. His period of confinement was over, so he was free to move about. But the prince wasn't asking for a day trip. He intended to travel far from the capital. Planning the itinerary would take time, and they couldn't go too far. Balk Valhard accepted the request and immediately set about making it happen. After his uncle left, the prince stayed in the room with Carls. He had expected his superior to demand something more unreasonable. After all, one doesn't receive a count's favor every day. In truth, Adrian only wanted the old man to stop being so stiff and pathetic, so he asked for an easy favor. Hearing his lord speak so bluntly made the knight laugh. Suddenly, Adelia entered the room, holding the long-awaited letter. It was a brief update from Lady Arwin K. Gazin. She had made a small breakthrough and would be visiting soon. A short, sweet note, a welcome piece of good news at the right time. 5 days later, Uncle Balk Valhard messaged that everything had been arranged. In 2 days, the departure date arrived. The first territory they passed through was called Alin. The prince was so excited he couldn't sit still. You know, Alin County produces the best weapons for the royal house. The place has iron mines that supply high-quality raw materials, and guild forges to refine it. More than half of the weapons and armor delivered to the royal family originate in Alin. Since Adrian's skills had recently improved so much, he was eager to find a new sword of his own. At first, he intended to pick a fine sword from the royal armory. Unfortunately, he was blocked by the king's orders. Considering the prince's clumsy movements, he couldn't blame his father, at least he could procure a decent weapon outside the palace. Surprisingly, his uncle took the trip very seriously, and so the roughly 20-day journey began. 3 days from the capital, they would reach the first forest stop, Alin. Then they would travel 2 more days toward the Iron Lion Fortress. Being stuck in the carriage for 3 days straight was deadly boring. Adelia sat opposite him, but she was no more entertaining. Maybe it would be better to spend the time checking his mana heart. At present, his reservoir was depleted due to the side effects of overusing the dragon-slaying poem. Starting to recharge slowly should be safe. He felt the carriage rock, the cold wind end, the night's conversation, and gathered the mana particles generated from it. At last, he was able to regenerate and fill his depleted mana heart. Surprisingly, the mana heart he formed was much larger than before. It was only a glimpse of a greater will. An effect of forcing himself to use the poem. His physique had undergone a qualitative change, expanded his mana heart, and improved its capacity to hold more energy. By unorthodox means, he reached an expert level of swordsmanship, enhancing his connection to his roots, and removing restrictions on some of his powers. His celestial sight and hearing were significantly upgraded. Overall, a single meditation session had elevated him to a different tier. He could feel powerful changes in even the smallest movements. He had taken another step forward. After 3 long days in the carriage, the traveling party finally arrived at Alin. The crown prince was respectfully welcomed and personally escorted by Edgar and Torrance Alin, the lord's sons. Considering the long journey, Edgar suggested leading everyone to their chambers first. Touring the Alin manor, Adrian understood why the county was famed as a weapons center. The halls were filled with all kinds of weapons. On closer inspection, the displayed blades were just flashy items, useless chunks of metal in real combat. Based on that first impression, Adrian doubted he'd find what he needed here. So he requested to be taken to the territory's Smith's Guild. Edgar gladly agreed. On the way, the local lord warned the prince that blacksmiths were rude and stubborn, without exception. When fully immersed in their work, they wouldn't notice even if the lord visited. Edgar greeted Adrian at length about respecting the artisan's spirit, even if it sounded a bit insulting. The forge's heat roared as they entered the room where the miracle happened. The air was filled with the clang of metal struck by hammers. Flames howled and bellows hissed. The smiths used fire and iron in perfectly harmonious balance. Among the artisans in that room, there was a particularly clear sound that made the prince hold his breath. An old man, hard at work forging a sword in the center of the room, drew Adrian's absolute attention. For some reason, each steady hammer stroke reminded Adrian of his first memory as Gruon. Adelia wiped sweat from her master's cheek, rousing the prince from his nostalgic reverie. While the whole workshop had stopped to politely greet the prince, the old man continued his focused effort. Zaxxon introduced the head of the reception, Zaxxon, the guildmaster. Adrian didn't care. All he wanted was to watch the masterful forging display before him. Zaxxon tried to curry favor with the royalty and shouted at the old man to work and show respect to the prince. Adrian had to clamp his hand over that bastard's mouth to stop him from ruining it, judging by the empty workbenches and the annoyed looks from the other smiths. It seemed the guildmaster had dragged everyone out without being asked. As a sign of respect, he requested the smiths return to their work. When everyone was back in their proper places, the prince focused intently and resumed watching the supreme performance. He just stood there watching an old shirtless man repeatedly hammer a glowing block of steel. The prince was utterly captivated by the process. You are in the midst of a blazing world. Throughout the years of its existence, you have never felt this sensation before. After they left the forge, Edgar explained that the old man had been continuously forging and melting down the same sword for the past 6 months. Every sword he made was said to be a masterpiece. He wasn't called a master artisan for nothing. None of his works lacked quality, yet he still melted them all down the same. Moreover, over the past month, the old man had hardly slept. He had devoted himself entirely to his work. Given his age, this was somewhat worrisome. A few days after arriving in Alin, the prince began coming to the forge early and leaving late every day. He simply watched the master artisan continue his harsh daily routine in silence. Contrary to the tension caused by the crown prince's presence, he caused no incidents. His stay in Alin finally reached its last day. On the day of departure, the master artisan worked harder than usual. The prince had intended to stay until he saw the finished product, but who could say how long that would take? He could only leave with deep regret, with countless matters still to address. On the night before departure, Adrian ordered his attendants to prepare a farewell feast. After the feast, Edgar burst into his lord's chamber at the crack of dawn, excitedly shouting about the master's completed sword. Overcome with excitement, the prince ran to the forge and saw the old man holding a majestic weapon. He was gently polishing the facets of his latest deadly creation. When it was completely clean and sharp, the master smith willingly offered the weapon to the prince. Looking at the blade, Adrian could picture the perfect words to describe the moment. It was a weapon as blazing as the sun rising on the horizon, cooling until its hue matched the deep crimson royal cloak. A sword like the sun and a king newly born. When it came to naming the sword, the smith suggested the name Twilight. To the smith it meant dusk, to the prince it would mean dawn. When the weapon was handed to its true owner, exhaustion quickly overwhelmed the old man. Before he could collapse to the floor, the prince caught the master smith. Feeling the faint pulse in the old man's body, Adrian decided to stay an extra night. On his sickbed, the old man recounted the moment he saw the prince watching him work. On that first day, the sword formed in his mind as if guided by fate. The sword itself had chosen the day it would be born. Knowing the smith was nearing the other world, Adrian decided to be honest and revealed his secret. Surprisingly, the old man received the truth rather calmly. A smith and a former sword spirit could understand each other best. As a final request, the smith extended his trembling hand and asked to hold the last sword he had forged for a moment. Grasping the hilt, he blessed that the sword would become as great as its master once was. Adrian promised it would be so, and the old man finally drew his last breath. At sunrise, Edgar ran to the prince's tent to behold the new sword. Twilight, a sword forged with his very soul. The prince held that the old man's blade was unsuitable for use, and that he should instead use a demon's sword. Though not top tier, the demon's sword Edgar presented was at least a fairly good mid-grade weapon. Seeing through Edgar's scheme, the brazen prince accepted the demon's sword and refused to hand Twilight over. To ensure he wasn't coerced, he pressured Edgar by invoking House Ellen's loyalty to the crown. The sly nobleman had no choice but to swallow his pride and feign calm. He had intended to tempt the prince with the flashy demon's sword in exchange for the master's blade, but in the end he ended up giving away both precious weapons for nothing, without delay. The convoy rolled out, cavalry galloping at the front while carriages and infantry followed at a measured pace. To make up for the delay, they had to hurry. On the way to the carriage, the prince happened to meet Bulk Vilhud. They had hardly seen each other during their time in Alin, because Bulk Valhard had been occupied with a private mission. From now on they would have to spur their horses to reach the Iron Lion Fortress before nightfall. Ironically, the prince didn't know how to ride. How could someone who had been a sword in service to his lord for so long possibly know how to ride a horse? The road to the Iron Lion Castle was chaotic. He had to learn to ride as he went. There was a lot of vomiting, frantic rearing, and wild spins. That could have been entirely avoided. Although it wasn't the half-day journey originally planned, they still arrived after about a day on the road. The renown of House Wallodon's Iron Lion was displayed in the welcome feast held for the Leon Berkerger noble heir. These lions were far more enthusiastic than expected, and the reason was obvious. These young men were surely displeased that their goddess had been snatched away by a worthless prince. Thinking it would be fun to provoke the lions, Adrian confidently stepped toward Arwin. When face to face, the honorable female knight knelt and offered her most respectful greeting to her liege. The pride almost lunged at the grand prince on the spot. Their reaction was immediate, but Adelia Byron was quick as well. If Adelia had lost control in the face of that hostility, it would have been bad news. The prince had to pull her back from the surge of murderous intent. Fortunately, he had continually trained her obedience. He turned back to Arwin and invited the Thorned Rose to accompany him elsewhere. There were many stories they hadn't yet shared, it would be better if the lions behind her came along too. The prince's first stop upon arrival was the training yard. He was eager to see the iron lions, those hailed as the kingdom's best. How would they act? Adrian issued an open challenge to anyone brave enough to step forward. But his status as Grand Prince was a bit troublesome, so he declared in the name of Leon Burke that no one would be held responsible for the outcome of any matches today. When coaxing failed, he resorted to taunting the lions. If no one dueled him, then that famed reputation would be mere empty boasting, wouldn't it? Unable to endure the taunts any longer, Dale of House Dennett stepped forward. He declared he was not worthy to represent the Iron Lion's swordsmanship, but he was willing to stand up. The prince was pleased that someone had finally fallen for his provocation. Dale decided to seize the initiative and rushed forward with a drawn wooden sword. Adrian answered the first strike with a thunderous blow that destroyed the man's body from the inside out. His red head slid along the muddy ground of the training yard. One down, many more to go. The prince ordered the knights to line up and test themselves against him. Next up was Paul Rotham, trainee number 53, unlike the rookie Dale. As expected, the fresh-faced knight was smashed to pieces before he could react. Hallie, a fifth-year trainee who thought himself skilled, was not. Judith followed, and the prince showed him absolute fairness. Each proud Iron Lion they sent forth was defeated spectacularly. The beating went on for half a day. Adrian emerged without so much as a scratch. After clearing out the apprentices, the prince felt an itch to pick a fight with the official members of the knightly order. To stir up more trouble, he loudly declared that Arwin would accompany him on the journey home. The Thorned Rose did not hesitate and accepted her lord's wish. This simple trick prompted an official Iron Lion to stand and speak. Having heard of the prince's fondness for gambling, the knight proposed a small wager to liven the mood. Before the knight could make a foolish spectacle of himself, he was stopped and told that Owen was not a prize for the tournament. They should bet something else. The prince tossed aside his worn training sword and asked Carls to borrow a real blade. The Grand Prince drew the demon sword and put it up as the stake for the duel. Anyone with even half an eye could see that the demon sword was a treasure. Uncomfortable with this arrangement, Owen tried to volunteer herself as the prize, but she was worth 1,000 times more than a mere sword. The value of a future Swordmaster cannot be compared to forged steel. Dunham of House Fahrenheit accepted the challenge. He was an official Iron Lion Knight, standing on the verge of breaking into the third rank. Essentially, he was at the double rank level, his sword being the 17th made by the master blacksmith. To be fair, he was also willing to wager this precious weapon in the duel, valuing the match more than a little. The prince decided to use the main weapon in his hand, which was also the master's 100th and final piece, completed just days earlier. Dunham activated his chain sequence, though he disagreed with the sword path the prince followed. He could not deny the effort it took to attain it. Out of respect, Dunham vowed to give his all in this match. Adrian would never get used to people pettily calling his Mana Heart method a misguided path. He understood that the respect due to him should rightfully belong to those who had worked hard under his command. The prince reminded his maid and trainee knight Adelia. Adelia watched closely. Adelia gasped, yes, a massive burst of blue mana erupted from Adrian. It spun powerfully, forming the towering spectral silhouette of a knight behind him. That radiance was overwhelming, eclipsing even the castle towers behind them. This is the path you must walk from now on. Adelia watched, mesmerized by the display of true power. Yes. Golden energy swirled around her as she pictured herself following that blue light. The gods will surely do so, Your Highness. Elsewhere, the sunlight flooded the drawing room as the Count broke the silence with a thoughtful question. So how many times have we visited the Iron Lion Castle now? Sitting opposite him in a plush green velvet armchair, Count wallowed and held his teacup, his expression obscured by steam as he answered decisively. This is the 4th time the 3rd prince and the 5th prince have visited while the 1st prince remains under house arrest. No matter how poor his reputation, it cannot be denied that the 1st prince is the kingdom's legitimate heir, which has led things to this point. He must bear a large share of the responsibility. If the commander of the 3rd Legion had supported the 1st prince even a little, Your Highness would not have become so isolated. Then why only now act as his protector? The Count lowered his gaze, thinking to himself that he was not wrong. I certainly once cast aside my own grandson. A man who is not only an incompetent ruler but a tyrant. He is my grandson. One day, when I scolded him for being intoxicated by some strange poison. Are you even sane? He lunged at his own uncle with a sword. A hopeless bastard. When I returned north in utter despair, he sent me wine laced with poison, bashfully calling it a gift accompanied by a letter. But the Count still drank the poison. Blue sparks crackled around his body as he purified the toxin. When I used mana to burn that cheap poison, where the sword came from, who knows? I also burned away the little familial affection that remained with it. However, that brat whom I thought would never change has now become different. He has endured harsh training and grows stronger day by day. Count Wallodon looked at him, bewildered by this show of protection. Didn't he himself say the first prince should never become king? He thought inwardly that the boy is now a completely different person than before, then stared into Count Wallodon's eyes, pleading with a rare vulnerability. Give him a chance, at least so he can stand on equal footing with the other princes. I beg you. Count Wallodon looked at him, completely perplexed by the proud commander's bowed head. I truly cannot understand. I don't know whether you or the first prince has changed. First, raise your head, you who are known as the Silver Savant. Suddenly, the double doors burst open and a knight stood there, alarmed, spreading his arms as he reported to Count Wallodon. Both counts turned to face the messenger. The first prince was. Outside, under the brilliant blue sky of the castle courtyard, Bulk, Valhard, and Wallodon strode quickly along the stone pathway. Try to reassure yourself, don't worry too much. Dunham knows his limits, so nothing serious will happen. Even in a real duel, he certainly wouldn't beat the prince to the point of despair. Bulk Valhard walked with a smirk, hands clasped behind his back. The one you should be worried about right now isn't the prince, it's your knight. Wallodon looked at his friend as if he had lost his mind. He really had become strange, pale, and now spouting nonsense. Suddenly, loud clashes rang out from the inner yard. As everyone froze at the sight of a figure flying through the air, the knight slammed into the ground, sliding across the dirt. It was Wallodon's knight, mouths agape. Dunham, at the center of the training yard, surrounded by a crowd of cheering knights. Wow, your highness wins again. He even defeated Dunham, the soldiers shouted in astonishment. Wallodon stared at the scene. What is this? Bulk Valhard folded his arms in satisfaction. Didn't I tell you so? Adrian wiped the blood from his lip, eyes blazing with fierce intensity. He's not the one you need to worry about. Adrian shouted down at the remaining challengers. His body was wrapped in a mystical blue flame. Continue. A few minutes earlier, Back had always said a true knight begins at 2 chain ranks. Adrian panted, sweat dripping from his face as the blue flames flickered around his chest. Those words were no exaggeration. The current training canticle was insufficient. He realized as he looked at his trembling hands that he couldn't summon the true dragon-slaying canticle to deal with an ordinary knight. In that moment, Adrian's eyes narrowed, his hyperfocus activated, and the world grew silent. All sounds faded away, and the charging knight moved as if in slow motion. He gripped the sword hilt tightly. This body no longer felt like his own. His left eye blazed with a penetrating blue flame. That exact sensation from that time. The knight swung his sword down, and Adrian simultaneously launched a counter-strike. Bam! Blue energy exploded outward on impact. Adrian's strike was heavy and decisive. The knight was blown backward by the raw force of mana. A wild grin spread across his face as steam rose from his body. He roared again. The crowd of knights went wild, shouting in amazement at his power. The man rose again and Adrian faced him head-on. Their swords locked in a shower of sparks against the towering castle backdrop. Adrian spun, trailing the blue flame, and struck. He smiled softly, savoring the exhilaration of battle. The knight defended desperately. Then more knights surged in. Adrian became a whirlwind of blue light, slashing left and right. His sword an extension of his will, the blade tip dipped to the ground. The sun setting, casting orange-gold shadows across the training yard. Adrian stood alone in the middle, breathing heavily, surrounded by defeated knights. He looked down at his sword, sweat dripping from his chin in beads. The spectators shouted loudly, their faces alight with excitement and reverence. Petin had been felled. That was His Highness's 5th consecutive victory. Deep within Adrian, A transformation occurred. A silhouette of light stood amid the storm of blue energy, enduring thousands of waves across 100 fights. I will hold firm even against a wave greater than that. Ding! A system window appeared. The training canticle had gained a new stanza. Only now do I rise to grasp the sword. The concentrated blue energy grew brighter, purer. The training canticle's level had become extraordinary. The canticle adapted to its level. The training canticle had become a dual canticle. Adrian whispered, vision blurring. I succeeded. His legs gave out. He fell forward and strong hands caught him before he hit the ground. Are you all right, Your Highness? We offer our respects for the victory you have won. Around them, the other knights' faces, human and admiring, glowed under the sunset. Honoring the first prince's sword, one shouted, honoring his fighting spirit. Another cried out, we offer our respects for your victory. Adrian blinked, confused by the sudden admiration. What is this? A moment ago they were eager to tear me apart. Having watched from the sidelines, their expressions had softened. They were simple men at heart. A sword and victory, nothing excites them more. Looking at your face, you must have thought you would incur their wrath. The Count continued, a glorious defeat is worth more than a shameful victory. When both sides have fought their hardest, does winning really matter? Another knight chimed in. Still, Dunham might be a bit resentful. The red-haired knight swore, yes, because he had to hand over the sword he bragged about to Your Highness. Another knight laughed loudly. What a relief. He was too proud of that sword. Adrian sat on the ground, listening to their laughter. He let out a soft laugh and looked down. I thought everything I knew had been forgotten and discarded along with the magic core, but it seems at least one thing remains unchanged. Knights are calm in defeat and revere the strong. Bright sunlight cast long shadows across the stone yard of the Iron Lion Castle. As the horses pawed eagerly before departure, the coach was ready while the knights busied themselves with final preparations. Adrian stood before the gathered crowd, a light breeze ruffling his cloak as he offered a warm farewell smile. Then until next time, Count Wallodin bowed deeply with sincere respect. We pray for your health until then. Adrian nodded. You take care as well, Count Wallodin. Please keep what happened while I was here a secret. A question mark almost hovered over Count Wallodin's head as he blinked, puzzled by the modest request. Wouldn't making this known be to your benefit? Adrian replied with a mischievous, fierce smile, smirking. There is someone I want to tease a little. The journey back was long. The convoy stopped in a clearing surrounded by woods. A knight announced, his voice echoing through the trees. We will camp here tonight. I will scout the area for a while. Adrian nodded. Go ahead. He turned his back to her and thought, well, On will adapt soon enough. He murmured as he watched the activities around the camp. Fatigue washed over him. He stretched his arms wide. I should go inside and rest too. Inside the tent, a radiant aura of cleanliness and service greeted him. Adelia stood there, having changed into her maid uniform, glowing with an inexplicable brightness. Your Highness, you have returned. Adrian stared at her in amazement, his mind reeling at the absurdity of the scene. The person I recruited was supposed to be an S-rank sword prodigy, yet she's doing only what a maid would do. Adelia noticed his hesitation and tilted her head, concern on her face. Your Highness, is there something troubling you? Adrian collapsed onto the bed, brushing the thought away with a wave of his hand. No, forget it. You may withdraw. Adelia bowed and retreated with an adorably worried pout. Yes. His Highness remained alone in the silence of the tent. Adrian looked up at the ceiling, his mind drifting back to the events at the castle. The Lion Knights were truly different from what I had imagined. He recalled the status panels he had seen floating above the knights during training, swordsmanship B, swordsmanship C when I used the power of judgment. Most official knights did not possess sword talent above rank B. In the past, these were people who could hardly reach the level of an intermediate swordsman. Even after a lifetime of harsh training, ordinary people would vanish in vain. Yet such people had attained realms equivalent to swordsmen in their 20s or 30s. The innate quality heroes once possessed had declined to an incomparable degree. While the potential of ordinary people had risen significantly, that was because of red mana. He was someone who could have aimed for transcendence in the past. That is why I am so displeased that he discarded that potential. However, this era is one in which there isn't even an opportunity to forge achievements far beyond the extraordinary level. In the end, everything is due to the flow of time. I must admit that I do not fully understand this era, so I will begin learning again from scratch. Suddenly, the sound of applause interrupted his meditation, and a voice rang out. That is a good thought. Adrian looked up, startled. Count Balkvolhud stood at the tent entrance, clapping with a rare look of admiration. It's not too late yet. If you put in the effort from now on, you can achieve your dream. Adrian blinked. What dream? The Count spread his arms, completely misunderstanding. Haven't you already won the hearts of the Iron Lion Knights? If other princes were in your place, they wouldn't be able to blend with those men so naturally. That is a very wise judgment. Adrian stared at him, his face twisted in a mix of horror and confusion. What's wrong with this man? He shouted. Are you insane? The Count looked bewildered. Do you not remember the terms of the wager I made with you? You replied immediately. If it was the bet about defeating the third prince, that still stands. He cut you off decisively. No, our wager was to defeat a second-rank knight. Adrian had defeated Dunham with his wooden sword, he thought to himself. Then I have effectively already won that bet. The Count stepped forward, his voice resonant. I will do as I promised then. Balkvalhard, as a Count of the Kingdom and commander of the Northern Army, I will officially support the first prince of the realm, Adrian Leon Beck. Adrian stared dumbfounded, thinking, what is he saying? Officially support. Don't tell me that. The Count gave a thumbs up toward the tiny tent below. Trust me. Adrian fumed inwardly. Since when did I say I wanted to be king? Then it faded into the vista of the royal capital, white with snow under a brilliant blue sky. The Count's declaration had become a real bomb. Voices rang out from every corner. Your Highness, congratulations. Inside the palace halls, knights and maids beamed with joy. We sincerely congratulate you. This is truly a joy for the kingdom. The royal knights and newly appointed soldiers have created an uproar, and the attendants and servants newly dispatched from the palace were no less busy. And I suddenly found myself at the center of it all. He waved his hand. Good heavens, what a chaos. Send them all away immediately. The knight standing quietly beside him shook his head. They've come by royal order. Even if I command them to leave, they will not obey. Adrian added, then at least clear them from my sight. This is driving me mad. After his pointed glance, the maid nodded understandingly, then slipped away into the high library. He sat on a soft velvet chair and sighed as sunlight streamed through the tall windows. At last it was quiet. Much better. Bang! The double doors were thrown open roughly. Brother, are you in there? Adrian looked at him. Why are you here at this hour? Jillian, hands on his hips. You're playing the fool quite well, secretly learning swordsmanship from Count Balkvalhard and even revealing such grand ambitions. Adrian stared at him dumbfounded. Who learned what from whom? Jillian clenched his fist. I was actually trying to spare you some face. How could you do this? I intended for him to lose without too much shame, he replied sarcastically. How astonishing. I'm moved to tears, he said, pointing an accusing finger at Adrian. His eyes burned with hostility. You've made a grave mistake. I plan to make you pay dearly for deceiving me. Adrian, exasperated, scowled in disappointment. This one, that one, I've said I have no interest in the throne. I need to find the mastermind who caused this. The scene returned to the private quiet of the tent, continuing the conversation with the Count. So, sir, I will play along for a while, so please withdraw at an appropriate time, because I'm not interested in things like the throne. Why did you start all this without consulting me? He paused, then asked sharply, are you worried about Balorhard? Balkvalhard is the shield that protects the kingdom from the monsters of the northern mountain range. The Count smiled confidently. So long as the crown and nobility do not forget the harshness of winter, nothing bad will happen to the Balorhard family. Adrian looked at him skeptically but felt relieved. If that is so, then that's a relief. The Count added, it's only a matter of time. In any case, it will inevitably happen. Do you truly not understand the fate of a firstborn who does not inherit the throne? The situation will not change simply because you keep bowing your head. If you need time to accept the situation, I will give you as much as you like. However, remember this, the legitimacy of the firstborn will not disappear unless you die. Left alone in the tent, Adrian sat in the dim light. I told you no matter how much time you give me, I will not change. What I truly seek is the authority and power that reach the realm of transcendence. So there's no way I'd want something as mundane as succession to the throne. I have certainly thought so. Cut to later time. The great doors of the banquet hall were opening wide. The room was filled with guests in lavish gowns and suits. The floor was adorned with intricate gold patterns. A herald announced loudly to the crowd, the legitimate bloodline of the kingdom Leon Beck. The firstborn of the royal family Leon Beck, His Highness First Prince Adrian Leon Beck, is entering. Adrian entered the hall wearing regal attire, a black high-collared coat with deep red accents and gold cord. The crowd parted to make way for him. Their faces were a mixture of curiosity, fear, and judgment. Until the ceremony began, Adrian strode forward with eyes piercing the murmuring crowd below. The nobles in lavish velvets could not take their eyes off the prince who had been completely transformed. A woman gasped, whispering that it was unbelievable. This imposing appearance was identical to the young king's. Adrian descended the final steps with an impassive expression. He thought to himself, are they making such a fuss just because I lost a bit of weight? Are these the kingdom's nobles? What a joke. The status revealed their true nature, the heart mark of serpents. Phantom purple-black snakes coiled around the nobles, their scales glinting with malice. It was the mark of dark karma accumulated by those who steal from others and trample lives, as if all of them carried such filth. The only one worth noticing was Adrian. He recognized him instantly. Taylor, since you're here, you should at least greet me, he replied immediately. Your Highness, I am sorry. I must thank you for the invitation. He observed and thought inwardly that this was the sole person lacking talent, yet uncorrupted. Yes, this is sufficient, like vessels to hold the seeds I will sow from now on. A crisp shout from the guards cut through the chatter, silencing the entire hall. The massive double doors swung wide as the Emperor of the Bourgogne Empire officially recognized the authority of the Marquis of Montpellier of Bourgogne. Adrian turned, as a short, corpulent man in a gaudy hat and a stiff purple cloak entered. Followed by guards, the ambassador of Montpellier, Bourgogne, was approaching. That name struck Adrian like a direct blow. What? He halted before Adrian, a smug, slick smile of satisfaction spreading across his face. Long time no see, Prince. Adrian looked at the man. Bourgogne echoed in his mind, triggering a vivid flashback of brutal violence. The implacable enemy that he and his comrades had fought relentlessly against 4 years ago, the name that had left countless scars on this land. How dare he stand before me? Suddenly red wine drew an arc through the air, splashing, soaking the man's face and his expensive ceremonial clothes. Adrian stood frozen. Marquis Bielefeld, an elderly noble with gray side whiskers, rushed forward in horror. Prince, are you all right? I was too hasty in greeting the prince. I apologize, Your Highness. Adrian snapped back to reality. I will need to change my clothes. Bielefeld bowed deeply. Sweating profusely, this old body failed to restrain itself, and I have committed a grave disrespect. A knight approached Adrian. Your Highness, I will escort you. Arwin looked at the elderly marquis who had stepped forward to take blame. Who is he? The knight answered that it was Lord Marquis Bielefeld. Adrian watched the old man bow respectfully. Bielefeld, so I suppose not all of them have rotted away. Well, does that mean my head has cooled down somewhat? A moment later, Adrian, wiping his face. The marquis opened the door and entered. I hear there was an incident. Marquis Bielefeld said you looked like you were about to cause some trouble. It seems he didn't speak entirely without reason. What the hell do you intend to do? Arwin replied firmly. I'm not that reckless. I simply cannot understand it. The Bourgogne family cruelly flaunts its power in the heart of the kingdom, and the nobles show him a sincere respect they don't even give the royal family. There is an atmosphere too tense to be called peace, and a relationship too biased to be called an alliance. Adrian asked, clenching his fist. Since when has the country fallen into this state? The Count looked away, tired. It's not a particularly special history. In the past, the kingdom stood firm against countless invasions from the Empire. Outstanding knights advanced to push back the enemy. However, as time passed, the Empire grew ever stronger and the gap widened. A panoramic view showed the Empire's vast, sprawling capital compared to the smaller kingdom. Before an empire that had become a superpower, the kingdom ultimately had no choice but to kneel. Adrian's eyes widened as he realized something. Don't tell me it's because of that. A map appeared showing Leon Burke's tiny territory completely dwarfed by the vast Bourgogne Empire. Even as a small borderland country, the kingdom still had something that allowed them to stand up to the mighty empire. From the very founding of the state, achievements had been accumulated without blemish. There were ordinary things and extraordinary ones when they were heroic tales. When they were legends and even myths. The martial god's song, we have lost all of that. He looked up at the Count, his face hardening with resolve. Uncle, I've changed my mind. He asked again, what do you mean? He answered confidently and clearly, to become king. I'll give it a try. The Count's eyes widened in shock. Adrian thought to himself, I may regret this decision, but it's something I must do. After all, I helped build half of this country. On the second day of the feast, dazzling sunlight poured down on the white stone palace. A voice echoed, the first prince of the royal house of Luenbeck, Adrian Luenbeck, is entering. Adrian entered the hall, straightening his coat, his face radiating supreme confidence. Walking beside him was his uncle, the proud Count of the northern Balk-Valhard region. Adrian glanced to the side, the nobles bowed, but they all avoided meeting his eyes. This was a perfunctory ceremony, even worse than how one treats a foreign noble. His mind drifted back 400 years. In the past, when my comrade stood before the people, no one ever thought he would become king, because he was merely a country boy who had run out from some remote village. Even among those who had been stripped of everything and driven away, he also had nothing particularly outstanding. Nevertheless, the boy still stepped forward before the people. Just like me right now, before those who have eyes but do not see, I stand tall while the notice board keeps appearing. Royal song, current ability cannot handle the song's level. A portion of the song is being ignored. A portion of the song is ignored. Using only one verse of the song equals 1/4. Adrian grit his teeth, feeling the tension. Compared to the true dragon-slaying song, this is still tolerable since this song is at a hero level, not mythic. However, a blue flame condensed above his head, forming a hauntingly beautiful crown. No song fit the moment better than this one. The nobles looked down, stunned into silence. A wave of blue mana swept over them. Even the corrupted nobles looked upon him with reverent awe. Adrian, his blue mana cloak billowing behind him, the crown gleaming above his head. This was enough now. He turned to the crowd, a dignified smile on his face. You may lift your heads. Suddenly, a dark purple energy streaked across the sky. Adrian froze. The source of the energy, an elf. The hood was lowered, a voice rang out. How surprising to think there are still people who remember the songs. Adrian's face went pale. He looked at her in horror. No, she was not just an elf. That woman was. When Adrian understood her true identity, terror surged within him, sending a chill down his spine.
Please like, subscribe, and ring the bell for more awesome content.